5 to 10 minutes maximum, worthwhile to stay on. With that, I pass it on to Janine for the first segment.
Thank you very much, Stefan. We will start our first segment with, which will showcase country examples and provide various stakeholders with the opportunity to reflect on their respective roles and to identify challenges, lessons learned, and good practices. We would like to first start off with a presentation by Ms. Mariama Williams, who will be setting the scene for our discussions. And she will be addressing the current ways of assessing and articulating climate finance needs. Mariama, you can have the floor. You can have the floor here. You can have the podium. The choice is yours.
Okay. All right. Good morning. Am I on? Good morning. Shall I sing? Okay. Hi. So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the LTF team for their long work on this issue of long-term finance, the climate finance team in general, but particularly those working on LTF. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed for all dignitaries, colleagues, and friends. The South Center is an intergovernmental think tank of developing countries. We are based in Geneva, and we work with developing countries to support them with objective information on topics under negotiation. Ambassador Felsen and Stefan has indicated the context in which we are looking at long-term finance in this session. So I'm addressing needs, and if I could get my little PowerPoint. Okay, so in the time that I have, I won't go through all of those. The presentation will be on the website, but just a little bit of context, which I don't have to go into because it's been done already. Then talk about some of the experiences with the instruments for articulating and translating needs under the convention, then some of the opportunities, challenges, and constraints with articulating, translating, and assessing needs. And with looking forward to filling the gaps and the way forward with some of the challenges and constraints on in this area. Okay, so that I won't go through, but I just, again, the idea is that we are focusing on the issue of what it is that constitutes and how developing countries articulate needs. And I want to say that needs are, developing countries' climate needs in general have two broad characteristics, right? Or at least three. They are long-term. There's a long-term secular set of needs arising from the long-term impact of climate change, which are known. But then there are the immediate and urgent needs arising from things like disaster, things like increased rapid pace of flooding, and other kinds of constraints that the long-term events forces on a country and its citizens, whether it's drought or immediate health issues. The needs are also driven from the policy processes set in place at the national level. And I will use the phrase enabling environment, but I actually don't mean what traditional people mean. I don't mean about setting it right for business. I mean the enabling environment in countries where governments set up processes for ministries to speak to each other and for citizens and the private sectors and community to speak to each other. The priorities that part of the challenge with implementing or translating needs have a lot to do with the priorities. And again, the priorities are based on a number of set of factors: urgency, but also on the financing available, whether those financing are from the domestic budget, as is pointed out in many of the BURs and national communications, and has also been pointed out in the series of exercise that has been carried out by UNDP called Climate Policy Institutional Expenditure and Review, which shows that developing countries are spending significant amount of domestic budgetary resources meeting climate issues. And of course, the needs are also articulated around the policies and directive coming from this process, the UNFCCC. Of course, the Paris Agreement being one, the INDCs, but underneath that also is the need to reorient domestic policies and climate policies around meeting the commitments of well below 2 or 1.5. So it's also hard to talk about needs without talking about the supply side. So I think needs is the demand side, the supply side is also important. So what's in the Paris Agreement is also important, and has been expressed earlier. Part of the need in this process to understand what developing countries' needs are, the motivation is that we can better address those needs by scaling up climate finance. But we also must realize that developing countries' needs are articulated in a context in which there are multiple objectives, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradicting, such as the Paris Agreement and the SDGs and sustainable development. They don't always go on the same track or on the same train. So articulating needs. In the UNFCCC, of course, there are quite a number of processes for articulating needs. We know of the famous needs study. We know of technology assessment. There are also national capacity self-assessment that's taken by countries. And in terms of reporting on needs and support received and what is needed, of course, we have the INDC, which is a star of the show, so to speak, NAMAs, which are linked to low emissions development strategies, NAPs and NAPAs. But needs, however they are expressed, needs to be translated into concrete adaptation and mitigation policies and programs on the ground. They need to be investment plans, they need to be detailed specification as to how you get from the needs that are articulated. And then there are challenges and constraints around articulating the needs, and I will get to those. And then lastly, how do we assess those needs in moving forward? And what are the tools and methodology? Now, I won't spend too much time on it because assessing was not part of my brief, but I just flagged that for completeness. So the key message here are that countries' national climate change strategies and plans are the context for their needs. And now until post-2020, so there is I think of needs when I'm presenting that, when I think about it's two parts: the pre-2020, which are the things that you must do now, the immediate urgent action that you must do now. And then there are those needs that are arising around the post-2020, which have a lot to do with how we mitigate, how the climate changes, and also the rules and procedures around the Paris Agreement. So these national climate strategies continue to be the basis for INDCs, and they're clearly defined, nationally determined contribution, and our country-driven processes, and take into account the Paris goal. So there's a need for the process to translating these INDCs, which are built on top of the NAMAs and the NAPAs and other climate action, into concrete projects and programs, and taking into account financing, technology, and capacity gaps as a basis for scaling up resources. It is important, and there is need to clarify the policies and enabling environment, both for the needs that are articulated and translated those needs, and to put that in the context of facilitating access to resource. So this means that you need enhanced and rapid project support and pipeline development processes, which far exceeds what we have now. I know that in the GCF, we have readiness, and the GEF has country support program, but those have a very long time processes. And in the case of the GCS, its project preparation facility is geared towards the accredited entity. We need actually more project preparation processes that are geared at the national level for governments and their entities to be able to help translating those needs. So there's need for an elaborated framework to support and enable better articulation and translation of need. And I think this could be the future direction of the LTF, with the support of the Standing Committee in terms of methodologies and tracking of issues. And it's my position that it's in the scope of the SCF. So this SCF should also consider how climate finance flows under the mechanism, take into account country-driven strategies and priorities and the needs of developing countries' parties. And lastly, the importance of enhanced direct access modalities. We talk about direct access in Adaptation Fund, in the GCF. the challenge is not with direct access as such. Direct access is a great idea. The challenge is with how direct access is implemented. And the time lag and the instruments and procedures that are created. We already know that within the GCF, we have a preponderance of international entities. That is not conducive for direct access. So we need to ratchet that up to have more direct organizations from developing countries as entities. And that's both our responsibility and the responsibility of the board within the GCF. Likewise, the same for adaptation. We know also for the LDCF, they need to have a direct access process that's effective and that works. Okay, so articulating needs, why and how, why, what, and how. Okay, so as I said before, in the convention, there are many mechanisms through which you could get a good sense of what developing countries needs. We're not in a struggle about climate finance because we don't know what developing country needs are. Countries have been articulating their needs, and if you go back to look at it, look at the NAPAs, look at NAMAs, you'll see that there's a very great congruence between what's in the NAPAs and what's in the BURs, and what's in the National Communication Strategy, and what's in the INDC. So the INDC is not some magic thing that occurred out of heaven. The INDC actually builds on the articulation of countries' work on the ground in their NAPAs and so forth. And you'll see, if you look at the LDC NAPAs and the LDC's INDC, you see quite a lot of similarities. If you look at what the LDCs are proposing inside the GCF for funding, you'll see a lot of it goes back to some of their NAPAs. So that countries have been articulating their needs. Those needs have not been met in any significant ways, and those needs need to be translated, and barriers to that translation into project and investment and finance flows into those areas need to be articulated. I'm just going to quickly go through, and I plan to spend much time, but in the BUR, there are justifications for finance and needs in the BUR, and many countries have. In fact, all the countries that I review have sections where their BUR speak to and give detailed reporting of their need and the support they receive. Ghana, in fact, was very meticulous in detailing the report of the support it received and the support needed. And also Malaysia, Chapter 5, speaks in great details about the challenges in articulating and translating it needs. So I am not presenting new information. The countries know. We have bodies of information under the reporting mechanism. It's now to really take those seriously and look at them and study them and draw lessons from them. NAPCOMs, same thing. And again, when you look across the NAPCOMs, the BUR, they all talk about the same thing. The needs are expressed in terms of money, technology, preparing for national inventory on mitigation side, looking at vulnerability, research. And all the countries pretty much have similar demands. And again, I try to cross-reference to what countries are putting in their readiness proposal in the GCF, and you see similar things. So they're not coming up grabbing things from the air. They're grounding their requests in the things that they've put in the BUR and their NATCOMs. So these are very significant pathways that we have in the convention where countries have already articulated their needs. NAPA, same thing. We know that the LDCs have their over 400 NAPAs, which are not met. Their needs have not been met, even though they were urgent and immediate attention, and there's a gap of $4 billion in terms of financing that. So there's a variety of challenges in translating the needs and implementing them. The challenge is not around articulating the needs, in my estimation. It's around the translation and implementing those needs and the constraints around those. NAMAs I won't go into. And of course, we know there are multiple other ways to articulate needs, and countries are doing it. We have National Policy Review Study. Tuvalu has a master plan for renewable energy and so forth. Mali has a National Sustainable Development Plan. And there are also sectorial plans that are very detailed. Nauru, Burundi, Burkina Faso. And then there are lots of regional studies by international organizations such as ours and pilot demonstration projects. And these all indicate and are trying to address needs. So needs is not an artificial thing that we need to study further. We need to actually compile them and look at strategic way of how to articulating them. Now, articulating of needs means how you translate those big policy areas into very finite projects and definitive projects that can be proposed for financing. These are the INDCs, and I just wanted to, if we say the INDCs are like the states of art in articulating needs, then they also give detail regarding climate action. And some actually give estimated cost of these actions. And some of them specify how much they'll need from external sources versus human sources. However, the INDCs, like the NAMAs, like the NAPAs, are not sectoral or investment plans. They are broad spectrum policy guidelines about where country want to go, their direction of travel. Those then need to be articulated into very specific kinds of issue. So my presentation in particular on NAMAs is based on at least 4 very good assessment reports that exist already. ADB has done one for its members, UNDP has done one, IGS has done one, and the most recent one is the one by Wischer et al., the German Watch, who've looked at the 180 NDCs and have come up that the aggregated cost of implementing the LDCs are $4.4 trillion or $349 billion per year. And they looked at the 180 INDC and said 79% include conditional and unconditional elements. Only 5 was without condition. 1/5, sorry. And the types of conditionalities that were put in by countries was around support, capacity building, technology transfer, market mechanism, and various other issues. Now, IED also looked at the LDCs and argues that the LDCs, the 48 LDCs and the INDC comes up to about $93 billion. Now that would consume, this is per year, that alone would consume the $100 billion that's on the table. So the analysis of the component of INDCs really show that there is a significant and growing yawning gap, a chasm even, between the needs and when those needs are costed. Now, I want to caution you a little bit about these figures, because you have to be mindful that it's very hard to aggregate across NDCs because they are using different time frames, different currency, and various things. So they just give you an indication, they signal an indication. And remember also that the INDCs are not a country's total project. This is implementing, these are the costs for implementing the INDC, not for addressing the full spectrum of climate change policies that a country will have to deal with. And these are the numbers that independent researchers are coming up with by looking at the INDCs. And so many are now closely examined and going to break in. So the challenges in articulating needs are, of course, finance, coherence in policy, institutional framework, gaps such as technical and capacity constraint, and these were flagged in many BURs and outcomes. Retention of institutional memory for technical capacity. I want to flag that because part of that has to do with how we do capacity building. We do capacity building as hiring consultants, often foreign consultants. There's not capacity built in the country. So when a consultant leaves, of course you have retention problem of institutional memory because it leaves with the consultant and you're dependent on consultant. So we actually need to rethink what we do for capacity building. In this process, capacity building has become a code word for consultants. And we need to shift that, and we need to, as developing countries, we also need to take responsibility for defining how we get capacity building and how it's delivered and how we retain the techniques and instruments that come with that. Okay, lastly, constraint, co-financing and cost sharing. Again, even for LDCs, there are co-financing issues. So a country in articulating and translating its policy, they have a need, but when he thinks about the cost sharing that it has to come up with or the co-financing, that may be a barrier to it actually translating that need into real project flow. It has to do in-kind contribution and also the timeliness of support and various other things. So I will stop there because I think my co-facilitator has been very good with me, and I will stop there and we could pick up later on some other things. And I said the rest of the presentation is available on PowerPoint. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariama. Honestly, I would have loved to listen to your full presentation because I think it's very rich, but as Mariama mentioned, it's online. And I think it's interesting that you said that there are lots of avenues for articulating the needs. The problem is when you start translating them, then you start to see how things start to change. And that's a challenge that we'll have to address. I'm going to now move to the case studies that we have to dig deeper into this particular topic.